I wish you a great day, my dear friends. My name is Shkolnikov Andrei Yurievich. I'm an analyst, corporate strategist, and geostrategist. And today we're going to watch the presentation of my long work of the conceptions that I'm using so that you can get an overview and get familiar with what I'm talking about. And I hope this video will be very interesting and very useful for your own strategic decisions. We're going to talk about the world and the Russian strategy from 2021 to 2090, and we'll see whether the Russian fate is predetermined. What geostrategy does is analyzing the strategies and the scenarios of different countries and other forces in the world. And as the result of this work, I've written a book that is called Geostrategist View on the Future of the World in Russia. And it's its first edition. I'm expecting the second edition in 2021, and it's going to be twice as much of a volume. My book is available in Russian language in the internet for free. Well, my job is not divination, it's not futurology. It's not about a single fate that is predetermined. I say that our world is excessive, complex, and unique. And it's too naive to talk about a single scenario that it can follow. We can only talk about probable scenarios, their probabilities, and the strategies that allow to achieve those scenarios. What people usually do is they try to find a very, very simple model and try to predict a single future using that model scenario. And of course it doesn't work. Well, that's because the universe is beautiful and exuberant, and people living in it, they have a free will to change the world. So the world is always dynamic. But then there is a question, maybe we can't predict anything at all? Well, I'd like to say yes we can, because if we look at all the possible scenarios, then we will see that the amount of scenarios, the probability of which is more than 5%, is very limited. And that is true for Russia and all the major players. Our job here is to pick out the most probable scenarios and find the ways to achieve them, which means to draw a trajectory, a strategy from this point to the attracting point of that scenario and see where we're heading. And after that we can interpret any of the events that are happening on whether this event pushes us to this attractor or that attractor. Whether this event is pushing us to the European choice of Russia, the Asian choice of Russia, or maybe even building the second USSR. Whether the globalization is being continued or the world is being torn to large pieces, or maybe we're headed to a global catastrophe. All of this can be found and explained. Everything that has the probability less than 2% is called miraculous scenario. For example, what is the probability of global political or economical catastrophe? It can be seen. It's not 2%. And what about a comet that lands near China and flushes it all away? Well, maybe it happens, but what is the probability? It's very low. And what about interstellar traveling and teleportation being invented in the next 10 years? Again, maybe, but the probability is also very low. You see, the major amount of those scenarios have very low probability, and if we sum them up, they will occupy less than 5%. Now, if we're talking about the classical geostrategy, it is built in the world that is static or mostly linearly dynamic, and the future is being predicted with linear functions. But we're gonna see geostrategy as the system that describes the deterministic chaos that is very sensitive to initial conditions. But nevertheless, the middle and the end state are not calculable because the attracting points are constantly changing, but we can try to figure it all out if we apply the complex enough thinking. That means we don't have a right to view the event in a narrow way. For example, if we see crisis, it's not only the economical crisis, but also the cultural, the ethnical, sociological, religious, and technological event. So there are many factors that influence each other, and we always have to view it as a whole. This is what makes the geostrategy, as I see it, a very complex discipline. Traditional geostrategy comes from the primacy of matter, which means that the starting point is the geography. The geography determines everything. There are countries of the land, there are countries of the sea, there are armed wars, there are trade and economic wars, and the ethnical identity based on blood. This is the classical geostrategy that has been used for the whole 20th century. There was heartland, there was sea power, there was rimland, the coast between those. There were also other attempts to describe it, like for example seeing it through history lens, talking about the concert of great states. There were conversations about New Yalta. All of those historical analogies is just an attempt to predict something using linear models without looking deeply into the details of what's going on. And things based just on geography and history stopped working, they don't work anymore. Let's say we use the classical geostrategy, then the question arises, where is the place for international communism, or the Vatican, for example, or the cluster of international corporations? There is no place for them there. Or let's take Israel, for example. Is the whole power of Judaic project represented just by Israel? Of course not. Israel is many times less powerful than the combined power of diasporas of Jewish people around the world. Let's take Vatican, which is just a quarter in Rome. Where is its power? Stalin once said, how many divisions does the Vatican have? It doesn't mean that he didn't know that the Vatican doesn't have divisions. The power of the Vatican is not in divisions. It's about its spirit, values and semantics, something that allows them to get into other communities and countries and influence them. That is why I say that classical geostrategy doesn't work anymore. It's too simplistic. Turning back to the previous slide, it's an orange box in there. And what we want to do lays in the yellow box. The more complex world and the more complex thinking. So what do we need to do with the classical geostrategy model? We need to make it more complex. Not just taking geopolitics and discovering the trends linearly, but also take various social sciences, pick out what we need from them, and enrich the geostrategical model with those things. So we're not developing geostrategy further, but we collect all the different social sciences and blend them together into something new. We'll be using not only humanitarian sciences, but also technical ones that will give us a much more rich, a better model that we can use for analysis. We get away from the primacy of geography because we also have the energy, the information streams, the cultural communication and exchange. So lakes, rivers, mountains and seas are not irresistible obstacles anymore. We take into account the development of science, technology, the communication between different nations. The power of China was, for example, that nevertheless, it was conquered by conquerors, they never had an ability to wear their cultural codes into tens of millions of Chinese plowmen. And as the result, they just dissolved in Chinese cultural codes. And now the world is different because information has been spread with lightning speeds, because every person who has a computer has an access to it, and every citizen of the city has one. You can now easily absorb the foreign cultural codes, like the books or film series, and those projects that required tens of years or hundreds of years are right now being done momentarily. Combined world culture and fashion is now available everywhere, and you have to take that into account. The new geostrategy takes into account that cultural, social factors became more complex, and that is why we now have three types of wars: the armed war, the economic war, and the psychic-historic war. Psychohistoric war can also be called mental war or psychomental war. All those three types of wars were present all the time. It was just different mix, and maybe we didn't see some of the elements. From three types of wars, we have three basic types of powers. The land power, classical example of which is Germany. They obtain and rebuild the land for their needs. Sea power, which is not about controlling the land, but controlling the trading channels and transportation channels, for example, Great Britain, or Portugal, or Netherlands in their time. They were all following the path of sea power. And there is network power, the Vatican, for example. Comintern was like that before Soviet Union removed it. In modern day, Finintern, financial international power, or Judaic project are of that kind. And we've got combined power as well. Russia is a combined power, partially land power and partially network power. That means that Russians were not spreading just by obtaining land and remaking it for their needs, like Polish people would do. By the way, they are very close genetically. But the Russians, when they came to a territory, the elite of the territory was integrated into Russian elite. The only exception is probably Kazakhstan and Central Asia. But in all the other cases, the elite of the territory was integrated into Russian elite. They were given the statuses, the privileges, and all the other things. The people remained with the same traditions inside their habitat, so there was no intervention into cultural autonomy. But Russians added education, including the education in the native language of that land, and also offered the imperial system of education without imposing their values too much. And that system allowed people to integrate into the whole. When they left their homeland, they were adequate in the rest of the empire. What is a psychohistorical value? It's a combination of religion, national traditions, and ideology. It is something that our ancestors lived for, what we live for, and what our descendants will live for. That is the psychohistorical value. Cultural canon, traditional canon, it's all here. And we have to understand that in the old world, the identity came through blood. Well, remember the history of the 20th century and what it led to. And now it's different. Russian is not the one who has a lot of Russian blood running in his veins. Russian is the guy who knows Russian language, Russian culture, and wants to be Russian. So he considers himself Russian. That is the key. But the Russian who converted to another religion doesn't like Russian culture or says Russophobic things. He's not Russian anymore. He becomes a part of that other culture that he has absorbed. National identity is now a part of the culture, of a wider understanding of culture, not just sculptures and paintings, but in a wider sense. Traditions, norms, principles, and so on. It's all culture. Values and language is also culture. Once again, a person who abandoned his culture and absorbed Russian culture, learned Russian language, maybe even baptized into Orthodoxy, and wants his children to be Russian, he is more of a Russian than the Russian people by blood that refuse the Russian culture. This means that the new world is more dynamic, mobile, and the old principles shouldn't confuse us. Now let's look at the world. The world has several scenarios that it can get to. It's not much of those scenarios, actually. In this slide, you can see all the scenarios that are practically possible in 21st century. As you see, it's just about a dozen of them. What we see now is the conversion from the global world to the world of regions. We also have a very little chance to remain globalistic, but it's very, very low. We are mostly likely to get into multipolar world of pan-regions. We also have a chance to get the neo-barbarian invasion. And there also is a scenario for global catastrophe and war. So right now the globalization is ending. It was built on the principles of right liberal plans. Let's understand that there can be several different types of globalization. Comintern, the communistic The left liberal globalization also was the scenario for the world. Right now, there are attempts to build globalization based on ecological principles as well. So there can be different globalizations. There are globalizations for the chosen people and for everyone. Right now, we're mostly likely getting into the world of pan-regions, from which we can either go to a sustainable tripolar world or get to a new globalization. Our goal for the next 20 years is to put together our own pan-region, the common territory that is interconnected economically, technologically, militarily, that is very much autonomous with closed technological loops. 20 years should be enough for that. And the goal is to have 300 to 500 million people of industrial population. I emphasize the industrial population because if we get, for example, the Central Asia population, it will not influence the development of the Pan region. What we need is closed technological loops to maintain the existing level of technology. That is our main goal, to form our Pan region in the next 20 years. So what most probably will happen in the next 20 years is this. In the next 3-4 years, we're going to witness the decay and the breakdown of the world economy. As a mankind, we tried to delay it for 15 years because that crisis should have happened in 2008. And instead of building the new world, the new economy, we just consumed the resources that we should have spent on that. I mean all the nations. We just swept all of our problems under the carpet. And that's why right now we're going to face a huge crisis that is not only economical one. Because when you see this crisis just through the lens of economics, you're going to fixate all the other aspects. But it's not true. It's going to influence each other. If economy gets down just a little, we get a lot of social problems. Let's get China, for example. If USA economy gets down 50%, China economy is going to do the same, because they're basically the two sides of the same coin. When economy gets down 50%, and in that case the level of life gets down even more, what happens to the social structure? People get hungry, they die, because there's a lot of disturbance, and even the state may fall apart. And you have to take it all into account. The political, the social, the cultural aspects. For example, when economy is fine, people and the government tends to close their eyes on the social contradictions inside the state. The same thing happened to Soviet Union when the state was powerful and centralized, and regional elites were not allowed to do much. Everything was fine, but when they sensed the weakness, they started to build their own little kingdoms. And we can see it in China as well. It's not a monolith. It has around 7 or 8 dialects that are actually different languages. And they all have their own self-conscience. It all can fall apart. So you have to take it all into account. 3 or 4 years, the world is gonna fall. And in developed countries, the economy will go down 50%. We already see it, even before the falls of markets, even before the bubbles burst. But the real sector of the economy will fall down 50%. In Russia, it's going to be around 20% if we start to close down our economy already. Then the next 2 years, the year 25 and 26, is going to be the definition of pan-regions, and the fall is going to stop. By the way, it doesn't matter what is GDP of Germany, USA, and the other countries. It's not going to matter. These numbers are exaggerated. You and me right now, as we're recording it, we're in the situation where we see the aquarium. There were fish, there was grass, the water was coming in and coming out, and getting cleaned, and everything seems fine if you take a picture of this aquarium momentarily. And now everything has changed. Imagine a pipe with 2 grids, where the grass is growing, where there are some fish. And in this flowing water, fish and grass dies and gets changed. And then somebody takes another photo shoot, and it seems that it's the same picture, but it's actually different. It's dying. It's falling apart. Back to the slide. So 1 or 2 years is the foundation of pan-regions. And if somebody's economy is measured as large, it doesn't actually matter anything. You need to have closed technological loops. Then 5 to 7 years, we're going to form the pan-regions and recover them based on the previous technological principles. I mean the previous technological paradigms, the fourth and the fifth, the industrial and the post-industrial, and then 5 years of transformation into sixth technological paradigm, which is additive technologies, robotization, and closed nuclear cycle. Additive technologies is 3D printing. Robotization means the production line that can be reconfigured into wide variety of goods, even for small series, so that the small series is the same quality as the large series goods. And closed nuclear cycle as an energy source. And it's the whole new economy. In this economy, around 50% of people are not needed anymore as producers, but they are needed as consumers. This is very serious. It will have a lot of social consequences. That's why we have to view all the aspects as a whole. So this is sixth technological paradigm. And by the year 2070, we're gonna have the seventh technological paradigm with biotech, artificial thinking, and programming in natural language. And by the end of the century, we're gonna explore space and get to the borders of the solar system. We don't know what kind of technologies we're gonna use then, but I hope it's something interesting. So we got the nearest 20 years down. Let's see who has the chance to form their own pan-regions. Actually, only 12 players, whether land power, sea power, or network power, have a chance for this. In this slide, the darker the square is, the more chance it has to form its own pan-region. As you see, the most chance goes to USA, China, and Russia. We're talking about 20 to 40 years from now. India and Britain have less chance, but it's still significant, and then there is not much chance. There also are network projects like Finantern and Judaic project that also have a chance for subjectivity in the new world. The main feature of network power is that you use someone else's resources for your own needs if you are a network power project. And another important trait of the new world is that to have a subjectivity in it, you will need to be able to lead an armed war, an economic war, and psychic historic war at the same time. You need to be a geostrategic player. The future is for those who can absorb those new principles. Let's get through all main players. Let's take USA, for example. They were following a path represented by Trump called Make America Great Again, which was a short civil war and rebuilding the country on the new technological principles. Jump into the sixth technological paradigm, the first, in around 2030, 2035, but they didn't follow that path. Moving to a new technological order means that the whole territory starts to live by that principles. It means that social, cultural, and political life is being reborn on those new principles. For example, compare the ideology of the fourth technological paradigm, the industrial one, and the fifth technological paradigm, the post-industrial one. It's based on completely different principles, not on production, but on marketing and management. So marketing, management, and microelectronics, that's what characterizes the fifth technological paradigm. And the sixth technological paradigm is the trans-industrial one. It's about additive technologies, robotization, and closed nuclear loop. So if USA followed the path of the short civil war, they would shake off all the problems of the previous technological paradigm, like they actually do every 80 years. They did it 2 times internally and the third one externally during the World War II. They got the most profit out of it, basically. But they didn't do it the 4th time. It looks like elites didn't have enough courage to risk, and elites are very important. By the way, in classical geostrategy, we're talking about people, nations, societies, but it's all wrong. It's elites who define the major things. You need to have somebody subjective, and elites are the subjective part of the nation. It doesn't matter whether they are the best or the worst of the nation. There has to be a group of people who take the responsibility and start doing things. And the elites of USA, they didn't choose the civil war. They chose the last legion strategy. They decided not to hurry, but to get into the 6th technological paradigm, just like all the other nations and players, in 2035-2040. This means that they gave us all a chance. They had their own chance to get into this new paradigm first. And each technological paradigm is a qualitative jump, a huge jump of economy, technologies, armed forces, and ability to dominate the world. If they did it, nobody would catch up, but they gave us all a chance. There also is a scenario called national catastrophe. It's if United States delay the rebuild of their economy as much as possible. It will look like a sudden fall of the economy. Some will say that the empire didn't have enough power to handle the situation. For example, at the time of its fall, Soviet Union controlled the bigger percentage of the world economy than United States controlled right now. And we could hardly handle 1/3 of the world. Right now, America is trying to handle the whole world. It won't work. The empire has failed. It left Middle East, now it's gonna leave Central Asia, and in 24th, 25th year it will leave Europe. 25th, 27th, they're gonna leave the Far East. Japan will be the last country that they leave. It's crucially important for them to weaken China because they can't afford having someone dominant in that region. They can't let China become a hegemon because in that case they cannot resurrect. But they went that way, they didn't risk, they tried to follow the middle path. And we want to thank them for that. Plus, we see that this situation will lead to destruction of America's founding fathers, so-called WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. A new America is being created, which is gonna be a part of Ibero-America. Because right now, not only Finintern supports this scenario, but also the Judaic Project and the Vatican. They are all interested in disappearance of white Protestants as a political power. If this trend continues, we're gonna see a lot of migration of this certain part of American society to Australia and New Zealand. I estimate it to be tens of millions of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And USA is going to become a part of Ibero-America, which will occupy two continents. I've been talking about this a lot earlier before, but there are articles as of 2018 on Shkolnikov Info and the portal of Aurora, and you can read them. I've been talking about this before, and even then I was talking about civil war as a good scenario for the United States. But once again, they were too afraid of this. The strategy of Finintern. Finintern is financial globalism, the right's liberals, and they have two basic variants. The first option is to try and maintain the current state of things using financial instruments, but it's doomed to failure, and they understand that it's just attempts to delay their failure. And there's another latent strategy, which is a creation of digital concentration camp, controlling the world through IT companies, big tech companies that control the information flow. It's been already described. While Finintern is burning the existing resources, the IT companies take over, and we're getting there. Plus, we also should remember the global catastrophe, which was COVID-19. Finintern understood that they were losing, so they decided to flip the chessboard. And the interesting thing is that if they flipped this chessboard around 3 to 4 months earlier, they wouldn't have so many problems with Donald Trump. But it is what it is. Frankly speaking, I thought that Trump would remain as president because that battle was very hard. And when there were courts after the elections, and at that moment, when judges betrayed him, there were 11 judges, 6 of them were conservatives, and only 2 of those conservatives supported Trump. And the interesting thing is that those 2 judges were appointed during the term of George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. And the other conservative judges that were appointed at the time of Trump, they all betrayed him. It was a clear sign that elites didn't want the civil war to happen. And it's clear to see that it's not about the election, the counting of votes, it's about elites. In the Anglo-Saxon system, courts are the tools of elites. It wasn't about Trump, it was about a short civil war and making America great again using the resources of Finintern, or trying to maintain the balance that cannot be maintained, trying to maneuver and sit on two chairs like they try to do. So they try to sit on two chairs, but in this setup, your balls can be squeezed between these pieces of furniture, and the world will definitely thank these chairs. Another interesting player is continental Europe. And here we have to admit that Europe has lost its passionality. No national interests, no religion, is just a grey mass of people with no values. It's just a dough that can be turned into anything. They don't have energy, they don't have passionality, and they are not ready to die for something. What is going to look like? Even right now in Europe, there is a fall of social and economical institutions, like the economy is going to collapse about 50%. People don't get paid as much as they got used to because the system is really corrupt. For example, in France, if you have 3 children, you don't need to work because you will earn less than you get paid from the government. And immigrants, they abuse this system. But then something funny happens with those people who are not used to working. And they have been living like that for generations. The new barbarians that are not used to normal living even in their original countries. So they came to Europe to become encumbrants. And they suddenly stop getting paid. They don't know how to work, they don't have farms, they don't have food anymore. And they hit the street with the demonstration asking for food. Tens of thousands of people and women and children in the front line. There are no people right now who can stop them and send them back to Africa, for example. Europe has a chance if it finds such people. And the only place where such people might still be is Hungary and Austria, where people have at least a little passionality. You can see it as a dark gray territory. The north is the territory of new hands. It's the so-called Europe of regions. France and the majority of the Iberian Peninsula also gets into this new hands, and the West Germany also gets there. It's the core of this new hands. And I have to say that the most developed countries of Europe as of right now, they're going to become the periphery of Europe in the future, without much chance for development. So the core is continental Europe and Vatican. And there is much chance for subjectivity and development, because to have such chance, they should have created powerful army yesterday. And there is no army, so who's going to protect? Who's going to provide order? And I'm sure you remember that United States are going to leave Europe, so it will remain waiting for someone to occupy it, being a periphery. And if Russia doesn't help it, it's going to be a wild territory. Let's talk about China, which is a very mystified topic. You have to understand that China has even more problems than the United States. And you remember that civil war was a good scenario for the United States. Capex around the world is around 20-22%. In China, it has been 39 to 43% for a long time. They invest 2 times more, and it doesn't have a return neither economically nor socially. And if something bad happens, they have a drop of 43% of their economy, and they are not able to build infrastructure. For real development, you always need the infrastructure of the future, not the infrastructure of the past. And they have been building the infrastructure for previous technological paradigms all the time. I mean, highways, railways, and houses. It's the past, not the future. Also, 18% of their economy is export, and summing it up with the previous one, we get the more than 50% drop of economy if something happens. It means the whole regions remain without work. And they will not be able to handle that because they don't have a balance in their economy when enterprises produce products both for internal and external market. Like for example, Japan, they also have 14% of export and import, but their enterprises are oriented both outside and inside. So factories will have problems, but they will remain their jobs. But in China, if there are problems with export, the whole provinces will stop. The factories will not be needed anymore. Peasant doesn't need an iPhone. In order to have the same level of consumption as in US or Europe, you have to have the same division of labor. Engineers, not workmen. and the level of education has to be equal as in US or Europe. But there isn't one. All these Chinese grants and subsidies to their enterprises and infrastructure doesn't really affect the productivity of labor. Therefore, the economy doesn't grow qualitatively. Structurally, the economy stays the same. It's no more than just joint responsibility. They need to make the structure of production and consumption the same as in the developed countries. So China needs 1.5 generation to rebuild its economy from social standpoint, education, technology, culture. The main problem is that they have the whole provinces oriented for export, and it's gonna close. No consumption, no production, no job. And it's gonna lead to hunger. And those people who got used to living as mid class in cities, they'll have to return to their villages where nobody welcomes them to live for $1 or $2 a day in labor camps. And we remember how Chinese people like to protest and fall the country apart, so I don't see the bright future for China if they don't work on this explicitly. The next player is Islamic world. There is practically no chance to overcome internal fragmentation inside Islamic world. There are no spiritual leaders that are important for more than 25% of the territory and population of Ummah. Plus, there is major separation into Arab world, Turkish world, Shiite world, Persian world. The contradictions are too high. There was an attempt to play using Black Islam, as we've seen in Syria, with Wahhabi and Salafi. It didn't work, it was stopped. Russia also worked against it, so that it wouldn't come to Russian territory. And now there is a game that uses Turkey, that attempts to recreate the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish world. It's also doomed to failure. And there also is an option called Asia Islam, also using Shiites, but it will start to happen only in 20 years, when the world of pan-regions will start to transition into the sixth technological order. There will be regional powers, the centers, and the border states. If a regional power doesn't have an ability to transition into a new technological paradigm, it might use help from another regional power. And we as Russia hope that this won't happen because we're very interested in Iran. Why Turkey is not likely to succeed though? Imagine if 100 years ago Russia lost the war and lost a lot of territories, like Siberia, Caucasus, and parts of European territories, and after that, what was left from Russia would try to convince the other demos who live, for example, on banks of Volga or in Caucasus, that their language doesn't exist, that their culture doesn't exist, and they are no more than just wild Russians. And for 100 years, they would try to convince them that they are wild Russians who talk some barbarian languages and forgot their true culture. And also, while doing that, Russia would do some genocide. And then, all of a sudden, it would try to offer them to resurrect the old empire, the pan-Slavic world. And that empire is going to be the center of Christianity because it's only us who were able to maintain the true Christianity that is called an Orthodox Church. But we also want to be a secular state. And when there are attempts to blend it all together, it just doesn't work because it's a blend of contradictory projects. In a nutshell, this is what Turkey is right now. They try to build a pan-Turkish world and also resurrect the Ottoman Empire and become a caliphate as well. Of course, remembering Kemal principles. It all contradicts each other and maintains a very fragile balance. Any major twist will make it all fall apart, and this is the trend that they are following right now. And another very interesting player is Great Britain. We tend to forget about those guys. 5 to 10 years ago, any conversation about Britain having subjectivity and leading something sounded silly. And we also shouldn't look at British people as aristocrats that were looking after their lawns for hundreds of years. British aristocrats are descendants of pirates, gentry, and opium dealers. And the strategy of Britain has always been simple. Who are we gonna rob? And for how long? In the next 20 years, Britain will try to build its region by robbing everyone they can reach. And there are a lot of options. The most powerful option for them is union with India, where they help India, and by the way, India is pretty much interested in that as well, or just simply robbing other countries. New hands will get under them in this scenario. Because we have to remember that Europe is not going to be united anymore. Every corner of Europe will have its own contradictions. They will fight each other. It will be not the level of states. For example, it's not France. France is shattered to several pieces, and those pieces will have forces fighting each other. There will be four types of players in continental Europe. The first ones are the right liberals. It's the modern European bureaucracy, mostly financial elites. Second is national sires, the right conservative forces who are currently national governments. The third power are the leftists of all kinds. And the fourth is Islamic network structures. And in Poland and Hungary, there will be a fight between right liberals and right conservatives, and the right conservatives are most likely to win. In France, there will be Euro bureaucrats, the right liberals, also the leftists, and also the Islamists. And it's really hard to predict who will win. In Benelux and Scandinavia, the liberals are most likely to win, and it will be the last piece of liberal world. So Europe will have a lot of pieces with huge contradictions in places. There can be caliphates, there can be national governments of semi-fascist type, some kind of new social nationalists, but not in the way the Third Reich was. Something on socialistic principles, but seeing the root nations of Europe as superior. And so back to Britain, it will try to rob them all. It has a lot of options. For example, working with Turkey that we see right now is also an attempt to create a pan-region with 300 to 500 million of industrial population. And the key moment for Britain is moving to Australia and New Zealand. The center of aristocratic, cultural, political influence will move somewhere there. By the year 2040, the Pacific Ocean region will become the center of the political wrestling, just like Mediterranean Sea was back in the day. And Europe will be a far periphery. And the main fight, the main development is going to be somewhere in Pacific Ocean. And Britain will move there. Of course, I'm not talking about the old people. I'm talking about the elites and business. There is a very interesting potential player called Ibero-America. Based on something in between the ideas of Trotsky and Che Guevara, it will be a global project very close to Trotsky's ideas of permanent revolution and building the shared left liberal world. There is no elite for this project yet, but Vatican and Judaic projects are interested in this a lot. By the way, Vatican stands behind the continental elites of Europe, and European continental elites are the old Guelph families that are around 700 years old, and they actually control a lot of stuff. And it's not about, for example, Brazil uniting the countries around it. It's a network structure that gets into all the areas of life. It's above the government. The future elite of this project is Fourth Reich, drug cartels, radical left partisans, also the leftist software engineers, and the employees of special services and secret services of USA that will go south. There are about 12 special services in USA. They all are mostly autonomous, and most of them are moving their forces south, creating reserve bases in Latin America. And when it all is finally formed, we are getting a very interesting project, Ibero-America, that spreads across two continents, occupying Latin America and the Central America. And if USA goes down the worst path, continuing the degradation, then the North USA and Canada can also be there. And this shift has already started. It's a very interesting project, and the probability of it rose after Biden has won, with the help of Vatican, Finintern, and Judaic Project. And in further future, this project can also try to occupy Africa. India doesn't have its own strong strategies in the period that I describe, because all its strategies are secondary to other players' strategies. But India has a very good chance to start developing in the seventh technological order somewhere in 2060s, which is transhumanism, building different types of people, because they are ready for that civilizationally better than all the other world. And it's not much of a cultural problem to them to create a new intelligence, some kind of a super Brahmans. The problem with it, though, is that we don't know if two types of intelligence are able to coexist on our planet. Because all the other candidates other than Homo sapiens were destroyed by our ancestors. So it's really interesting. But as of now, India would better co-pilot with some other player who would protect it. Because nevertheless it has a lot of ports and access to sea, India still cannot become a sea power. Because its army is always busy confronting China in Himalayas. It became critical from the moment China occupied Tibet, because independent Tibet is very important for India, in case China falls apart. Alright, next player is Judaic project. That is usually ignored by the other players. But we have to understand that Israel is just a small fraction of its power. And this project is actually very powerful. It has Israel actually as a pain point because it was created at the wrong time in the wrong place. And Israel holds it back. Because Judaic project cannot let Israel be destroyed. Even though Henry Kissinger used to say that Israel will not exist in 20 years, because there isn't much sense in it. And on the other hand, the only thing that can protect Israel from destruction is consensus between Russia and Iran. And it's pretty likely to happen. So Israel can remain. And also it's interesting as an element of a new arc, a part of Jewish project, which is one of the options for Russia. Japan is another interesting player, and it's very surprising. There are two countries that are best prepared for the future world that is falling apart, or a catastrophe, or a phase transition. It's not just a crisis, it's a phase transition. It's really, really different, because the economy is falling down. 50% is just one of its elements. So Japan and Iran are best prepared for this world falling apart. The main problem for Japan is that it's the last country that United States will leave alone. And by that time it will be clear to see that all the territories around Japan have already united into pan-regions, so it can't create its own. And as one of the options, Japan will have to start a war with China, and China desperately needs a war to fix its internal problems. By the way, if this war happens, India will be Japan's ally. And another major option for Japan is to be someone else's junior partner. And it will not work with China, because historically China remembers Japan as wild Chinese people who committed genocide. And the only one who can protect Japan is Russia, with its nuclear weapons. So Japan is either going to be our ally, very uncomfortable yet interesting ally, or it will be our enemy. We'll see. Iran is somewhat similar, with its differences though. Iran will develop, but in the next 10 years it can only count on becoming a regional power. We also have to understand that Iran is not a territory of Iran, basically. It's a combination of order structures. It's like, for example, in Europe, Roman Pope would get a control over Roman Empire. And all the orders, the Knights of St. John and maybe even Templars, would become parts of this wide order structure. So Iran is just such a combination of order structures where these structures are connected with personal relations and obligations. And when Soleimani was removed, the big part of those relations was also removed. So Iran is wider than Iran state. It's a part of the Shiite world, and this identity is more than national identity. They have different thirds of those people talking in different dialects and maybe even languages, but what connects them all together is the Shiite culture, and that is much more powerful of an identity than being a citizen of Iran. This means that Iran will integrate the nearby territories as well. Mahdi army in Iraq is also an example of the order or quasi-order structure. This structures is the feature of Shiite project, and we will need them as our allies starting from around 2050. So we need Iran to be a state, to remain a state, to be subjective. We need it to retain its principles. And as for Japan, we need to offer them protection and get them under our umbrella. We will have a choice to either get Japan in our pen region or get Germany in our pen region. And regardless of the option, we will also need Korea for technologies. And now we're getting into Russian strategies. As you might understand from the previous lecture, we now have the classic situation that usually occurs during the World Championship, during the last several years. If we don't win in this group, why even bother participating in the championship? Everybody has really huge trouble. And that's why Russia has several real strategy of getting out of this problematic field. And if we compare the current problems of Russia to the problems of Russia in the start of 20th century, after the World War I and the February Revolution of 1917s, the complexity of that situation that we handled correctly and built a great power, one of the two in the world, the complexity of that task was around 8 out of 10, maybe even 9. But now the complexity of the problems of Russia is around 4 or 5 out of 10. This means that we actually can handle this situation well. And we have several ways to do it. First of all, we need to understand that Russia has to form its own pen region, which is 300 to 500 million people of industrial population. We need to close our technological loops, fill the gaps, obtain the technologies that we don't have right now, and then move to the sixth technological paradigm. And if we don't do it, we'll be the second or the third to enter this new technological order. And as I've already mentioned, the qualitative difference between these economies is so huge, it is even greater than the gap between industrial and post-industrial society. The trans-industrial technological paradigm changes everything, changes the core of the economy. It is a multiple times more effective economy. It's a total economical dominance. And if we take into account that Russia has all the required resources to make this transition, we can do it and we need to do it. So with that in mind, let's dive deeper into the different options of Russian strategies. So the first one is liberal dream, which says that we are the retarded part of the Western world. All of our liberals, ultra-liberals, the right wing, they all share this ideology. It says that we are the stupid guys and we need to be led by Western partners, and we can see what the strategy led us to. The second option is the third Rome, which says that we are the true conservative Europe. We are the real Europe. It says we need to come to Europe as its gendarme, bring some order, and save the true classic European values. The main problem with it is that this scenario is more about the past than about the future. And if we spend our resources to help Europe get out of this hole that it has put itself in, we get a huge delay in transitioning to the sixth technological order. And another danger is Guelph elites that are very good at seeping into our allies, and they are able to take control over all of our power structures in 2 generations. And it's Vatican that can actually easily unite with Orthodox Church and absorbs the dogmas and the belief system and all the other things. Like they easily changed the Our Father prayer recently. They can bear it. They can tolerate that for some time. The fact that the Pope is no longer the main guy in the religion, they can handle this. They will do it for the future obtaining of control over all of our structures, so they can bear it. Just like they are supporting inclusive capitalism right now. And in 5-7 years, all of our temples will be occupied by Jesuits, because our religious structure is much more vulnerable than Vatican. That is very good at working as a network power and obtaining more and more power for itself. So, can we actually go with this strategy? Well, if we understand that Europe is becoming a periphery in the new world and we can obtain their technologies for a while, if we say that it's just several general governorships where we obtain people and technologies from just to send them to our east to build the infrastructure, in this setup we actually can follow this path for a while, leaving Europe as a wild land and building the new Europe, the new European culture in our east. All the people, technologies, development, it's gonna happen in the east. In this case, we're gonna welcome Germany and its technologies, which are actually not the best in class. Japan would be much better, and Korea as well. The next option is we are the new center of the world, the Soviet Union too. This option can become reasonable only if the economy gets down to the level of the start of the 20th century, which means not 50% fall, but around 70% fall. In that case, mobilization will need to be done rapidly. But in this case, we will need to go through civil war. In case of mobilization of economy, either left or right principles, 200 main enterprises have to be under control of government. And I'm not talking about nationalization here. It's not necessary. Because if we're talking about military-industrial complex, like for example Kalashnikov works, it's all under the control of government, although it's 50% private. And the same thing can be done with many other enterprises if we're following the right path, which is the third Rome. If we're talking about the left project, the Soviet Union too, it will be nationalization of those main enterprises. But in Soviet Union too, the problem is that even small and middle-sized business will have to be put under the control of government, and that unfortunately means civil war. And also the main thing that Soviet Union too lacks is ideology. We can't live without it. We've already been through the fully atheistic left ideology and it didn't work. We will need a system with very advanced moral and ethic. It can be done by rebuilding socialism and reframing communism. We'll need to see these economic constructions, the base and the superstructure, and we will need to enrich the base with the things that are outside of the economy as well. Because classical Marxism did a pretty good job describing economy, politics, and sociology. But here's the deal. What is the temple from the Marxist point of view? It would say that it's just a theater where some play is being done and the money is being paid. They don't understand it, but it makes a lot of sense to people actually. We will need to add moral ethics, spirituality to the economic base of Marxism, and also the social psychology, so that we don't consider human as a rational biorobot, but as an irrational social animal. But we cannot just add Orthodox religion to economic base. In that case, we would just get the neo-feudalism. We need to get our example from the Protestant work ethic. And we'll need to form the Orthodox creative ethics. Creative because the times are different. And the new technological order is all about creativity, not work. Most people will not be needed as labor. Being able to work will be a blessing. So we get this orthodox creative ethics, combine it with economics and social psychology, and then we get the new theory. Without it, the second Soviet Union will not last too long. We'll just get to the late Stalin's economy and that's it. Another option is unity of land nations of Eurasia, the new horde, the southeast choice. It's all about standing back to back with China. In this case, we will not be able to collect this 300 to 500 million of industrial people because all the resources will be wasted on Turkish guys to raise their level of life, to make them consumers. And by 2040, the demographics just won't be there to get into the sixth technological paradigm. And the Turkish guys will be the half of the population on the lands where the infrastructure had been built. And then the state will be divided into two. And the Russia remains with the territories even smaller than in the times of the Ivan the Terrible. And Far East also separates, which means the death of Russia. So the guys who want us to stand back to back with China, they actually offer us to be a soldier of fortune for China. And then, after 20 years when China falls apart, which we also mentioned, we then separate into two states, the Slavic and the Turkish. And the Turkish guys will be the junior partners to different other pan regions, like Britain, for example. So it's a suicide for us. But we have another scenario, the positive Eastern scenario, that is called the Queen of Seas. That means building 3 or 4 large agglomerations in the Far East as a basis. The capital gets transitioned to the southern Siberia, and all the future, all the development is in the Far East. And it also means alliance with the countries that are anti-China, which is Japan, Korea, Mongolia, Philippines, and Vietnam. All the guys who are afraid of China and can get under Russia's military umbrella. And the territories marked as inner circle, here we get them in the metropolis and integrate them and form the union with that anti-China guys in the Far East. It can be really different conditions, like free transition of goods and money, but without free transition of people, military unions, trade unions, but with restrictions of capital movements. And also there is a southern scenario for 2050 called the New Ark or Abraham's heirs, which means the union with Iranians, Shiites, and Jews, strangers with brothers and brothers with strangers, like we all are the sons of God, the heirs of Abraham. Psychohistorically, we're solving the problem where we need to get out from European values into Far East, and we need some common values with those guys. And the construction will be like this. There was Abraham, there was Noah's Ark, and the mountain, and then there are Persians, Shiites, the strangers to Islamic world, then the Orthodox people, the strangers to Christianity, and the Jews, whom nobody likes as well. And those 3 ways are leading up the mountain. Each way is unique and very hard. You cannot change the ways, but they all lead to the same top of that mountain, the cradle of ancient civilizations. And remember that it will be the 6th technological paradigm, where there are no problems with scaling and all the territories are agreed upon. So if we combine this new arc with either the Third Rome or the Queen of Seas, it's going to be a very powerful combination that will get us out of psychic historical problems and open up the way to colonize Africa together. The Persian north of Africa, the southern part of Africa to Israel, and we get the middle part. We have a great experience in soft integration of different nations and raising up the cultural levels of the nations, and we can use it on Africa. It will be a very interesting ethnogenesis, where the parts of the root culture will be integrated with the imperial principles and culture, which is a very good option. And also, there is a north strategy called Hyperborea. That means we are the pioneers, the heirs of the titans, and it's not about finding some artifacts there. It's about the culture of great willpower, when we get into the dark, into the cold, using the cockle boat to navigate the ocean. And of course, it's actually about space expansion. Space goes along with everything else. By the year 2035, we're getting the nuclear tug that has already been announced. By 2040, there is a space elevator being built. And in the year 60 or 70, during the seventh technological paradigm, we're getting bases on different planets and satellites where the full cycle of life can be led, from birth to death. And by the end of the century, we get to the borders of the solar system, and then we hit the limit. But you know, the mankind is very interesting, because each time it hits any limit, it finds a way to overcome it, whether it is ocean or mountains or technological limits. So I hope that we will be able to overcome the speed of light by the end of the century. But it's far above the limits of geostrategy. So Hyperborea is about tens of thousands of people of great willpower, long willpower, who will live in the outside worlds by the principles derived from Russian culture. The ability to go there into the unknown and live there like children of stars, I don't know. And the funny thing is that development of the Arctic right now is being done by these principles. Even our bases are formed as stars. It's a culture of galaxy expansion. Plus, we have to understand that if we're talking about space expansion, then Arctic development or the bottom of the sea development is just an accompanying technology package. Because if we can survive in space, it's no problem to survive in Arctic or at the bottom of the sea. So it's very interesting, and it should be done at the end of 21st century. Now let's talk about the choice points for Russia. The first main point of the choice is whether we go right or go left. For example, the left choice is the mobilization economy, nationalization of 200 main enterprises, resurrection of the institutions of public consumption, and social politics. We have several years more to choose. The bigger problems the outside world has, the easier it is for us to make this internal change. And then there is the inertial path, called the third Rome. If we do no major changes in our inside and outside politics, this is the path that we follow. And following this path, we can actually return more territories that we lost after our allies betrayed us and Soviet Union was shattered to pieces. And it looks pretty nice, but personally I have a big problem with it, because I don't prefer strategy that gives us 20 to 30 years of good times and then leads to our fall. I want Russia to exist more than another 100 years. I want my grandchildren, grandchildren to be Russians. So if I meet and talk with my grandson, I would like to understand him, culture-wise and language-wise, and not consider him a wild guy. And I want the values to remain. Just like if I met my great-grandfather, I would understand him. And as any other player, the goal of Russia is to remain subjective and pass its traditions on, as a bare minimum. Of course, these values will be transformed here and there, but the core will be passed on, and the maximum target is to become a global project. As an intermediate target is to be one of the three in the tripolar world, but the best is to build the whole civilization on our principles. And yes, for now it isn't going well. The only attempt was the left conservative project, but it didn't work out. But we have a lot of other chances. So yeah, the choice point is left or right, and that means who do we ally with? Either Germany or Japan. Who is going to be our junior partner? Now you have to understand that in nearest future, the armed forces is going to be the key. This is the core of Russia's resurrection, both technologically and economically. And we have to say a huge thanks to those who collected all these companies. Rostec, Rosatom, Roscosmos, so it now works as a whole. Also, huge thanks for those who prepared our army, and Syrian operation actually showed that it works in real life. So this is the way to our future. Because using this army, we can protect all of our allies. And we'll see it's either Germany or Japan for technologies, and moving to sixth technological order, and also Korea is very important. We can't let Korea go to China, because for China not to fall apart, it needs Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and Iran. For most of those territories, we cannot let China obtain them. Taiwan, though, well, it can be obtained by China, but in this case, it shouldn't retain the microelectronics industry. It will probably be destroyed by that time. I consider that USA is going to perform this task. I think that USA will either destroy or evacuate all of the industry from Taiwan. So the key task right now is to solve the problem of passionarity. Passionarity as a phenomenon was described by Gumilev, but I don't agree with him on the nature of passionarity. I don't really think that it's about biology or some cosmic waves. I think that passionarity is not biological, but social phenomenon. If the world was built only on the principles of demographics, we would see the following picture in history. For example, there are territories where people can live comfortably, like Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, and on all of those territories the population would grow and grow. Then there would become too much of them, and the part of the population would go to the territories that are not so good but also okay for living, chase away or kill the people who lived on those territories because they go as a wave and they are organized, and those guys are not because they don't expect this. We would have this great step with the armies of nomads expanding further and further to less and less comfortable places like Sahara and Arctic and stay there. And those waves would repeat themselves once in several generations. But did we see this? Not at all. For example, the Mongolian Empire, 300 horsemen came and conquered China, and there's been a lot of nomads conquering China, but it didn't matter. That is why it's not about demographics, it's about this passionarity. And it's not biological, it's social, because if we take Europe, there were just a couple of social experiments during 2 or 3 generations, and we see zero passionarity. Biology couldn't change much. That's why I conclude that passionarity is a social phenomenon. There is a thing called 4 generations of Buddenbrooks, or 4 generations of Ibn Khaldun. It's about the following. The first generation of nomads comes from the desert, conquers the land, kills all the local states and powers. The second generation of nomads expands the territory and creates an empire. The third generation encourages culture and art and plants cypresses. And the fourth generation is getting killed by the nomads that came from desert. That is why the society needs to be shaken up from time to time. We need to bring up the best to the elite. And by elite here, I mean the ones that own the resources, not the ones who are biologically the best. So we need to shake it all up. And in Soviet Union, for example, we had the first generation who obtained power in 1917. In 1930s, the elite was formed because the first generation doesn't form an elite. They are revolutionaries. Then this was shaken off and new passionaries were invited after the war. And in the 80s, the elite betrayed its country. And people with negative passionarity came to power. And what options and trends we have now? The next time the power is transitioned to the next generation, we will see the fall of the passionarity. This is very bad and it happens all over the world. Because the last true passionary was actually Fidel Castro. There are no such people anymore, the great people who provided the life for the next 4 generations. But we hope that there will be ones, because the era of change contributes to that a lot. We need to call passionaries to the elite, just like in the end of 90s, when people from armed forces and special services came to power. We need young people of 40 to 50 years in power, with burning eyes, with experience, with the spirit of service. people who are ready to fight for Russia. We need them in the place of those 3 to 4 thousand of people who control Russia. And on the next people, we need as much young, energetic people as possible. We need to remove the fifth column, all the liberals, from all the major places of power. And if not, then in 2040, we either go to the destruction of our country or another call out of pensioners into the elite. So we need not to sit still right now. We need to call out pensioners into our elite. The people from regions, the people of service, from armed forces, just like it was done in the end of 90s. That's what we need right now as a country. And if we go down the right conservative path, we need to understand that there will be territories included into Russia. And there's a huge question whether we should or should not obtain Little Russia, the current territory of Ukraine, because it's very poisoned by Nazism right now. If we don't, then there is an option to create the second Grand Duchy of Lithuania, with the capital in Minsk. That will be a buffer for rebuilding things. Because during the last 25 years, Belarus had its nationalistic ideas conservated and stopped. Because after there was a nationalist Shushkevich, there came Lukashenko, and he chose to conserve the situation. Because we need to remember that Belarus is not a separate state, it's always been a part, the fraction of the Soviet project. And it always had the best Soviet elites, people like Masharov, for example. And this elite stayed true to its principles, like, for example, KGB. And of course, they degraded and lost passionality, but it wasn't still is the Brest fortress of the Soviet project. They maintained a lot of traditions, although they adapted to the changing world. And that's something that can be used actually as a sum for those people who are infected with Nazism and nationalistic ideas, softly and steadily. Because we cannot integrate them into Russia right now. We would get the same problem as with the western part of Soviet Union back then. So this nationalism has to be steadily and softly, gradually removed on the nearby territories. So we get Eastern European General Governorship, South European General Governorship. These are just the territories where we remain order. There's not much development there, and the pensioners migrate to the center. And the West Europe is mostly none of our concern. If we choose the right conservative path, we would continue to become the third Rome up until 2040. Then we will have 10 very unpleasant years, because by that time, the proteges of the wealth elites will arise in our power structures. They will try to build up their career, and we wouldn't actually know who is who. That is because for several generations, these people connect with elites, and it doesn't get recorded anywhere. They go to the same universities, they know Russian language, they are in the Russian culture. How do we know that they are imposters? We don't. In the 2050, we have to switch to the strategy called New Arc. By that time, we need to forget about European traditions and switch to the new Iran and Israel principles. Then we go with the gradual development in the next 30 years. And in 2080, we switch to Hyperborea and go expand to the space, leaving the boundaries of the Earth. And then there is the end of the 21st century, and geostrategy cannot explain anything beyond that. If we're talking about the Far Eastern choice, we should always know that China doesn't have junior allies. China only has vassals and slaves, and neither Japan, nor Korea, nor Philippines, nor Vietnam like this position. Why should they comply with the vassal of China if this vassal cannot protect them from China? And we will also need to give our attention to Chagatai Ulus, which is Middle Asia and Afghanistan, which is very archaic, pre-industrial, and soaked with Wahhabi and Salafi currents. Back in the days, Soviet Union tried to bring this territory to order, and now it's all denied and forgotten, and we have to start all over again. But if we put all of our resources to that, to help them, and burn ourselves, we will get nothing. And also, if Turkey falls apart, we're gonna get one of the territories of Turkey. and the Straits and Izmir will be ours. Not as our territory, but as Porto Franco, because the majority of its population is crypto-Armenians, crypto-Greeks, Circassians, Kurds, and all of this will start to form its own states if the Turkey starts falling apart. But if we follow the left conservative path, the logic is pretty much different. We turn left until 2025, then we switch to the strategy called the Queen of Seas and expand to Far East, and by that time the power of USA in that region degrades and we're gonna fill this vacuum and we build our unions there, and then we get a very interesting thing. Because it will go okay until the year 50 or 55, but then we get problems because we don't have psycho-historical unity. And once again, we need to switch to the new arc strategy. In this case, we can survive the betrayal from any of the countries of the Queen of Seas alliances and build a more robust and powerful structure within the new arc strategy. And then we switch to Hyperborea. And here you see another representation of the field of Russian strategies. Right now we're at the point of choice whether we go left or right, left turn or third Rome, and after that we choose between the Queen of Seas, the New Ord, and the Soviet Union too. It all depends on the problems and complexities in the world. Personally, I think the best option is to turn left, then switch to the Queen of Seas, then switch to the new arc, and then proceed to Hyperborea. We are one of the three poles of the upcoming tripolar world, and we can survive throughout this century pretty easily. There also is an option to go to the third Rome, turn right, then switch to the new arc, and then go to Hyperborea. The third Rome is much more complex because it's weaker, but our inertia right now pulls us there. So, my friends, I thank you very much for your attention. You have watched the introduction into geostrategy, into my understanding of it, into what are national strategies, what awaits us in 21st century, and whether Russia's fate is predetermined. So now you have this base, you can watch all the other of my videos and read all the other of my articles on Shkolnikov Info or on Aurora website. Also, these articles were collected and combined with a little of editing into a book, and all of it is available online for free. And as for my book, you can also find it in the internet or on Aurora website. And I specially decided so that it would cost only 1 ruble, so that people pay at least some attention, not just hit the download button, at least performed some action to appreciate it. And one of the guys bought it and put up in the internet, so you can easily find it as well. So I encourage you to read it, to think about it, to combine your own strategies. The second edition will be out soon, and it will be twice of the volume. And I hope that the third edition will not be needed, because the major stuff had been predicted. I hope so. So I thank you very much for your time. I hope you had a great time. Now you understand who I am, what I'm talking about, what is geostrategy in my view. You already know that the future is not predetermined, but there are several options for each of the players, which I collected and presented to you. I also shown you the points of choice, the pivot points, so that you can understand what is happening in the world, so that you can see risks and opportunities and make the right choices. I thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon. See you later. Bye.